Madam President, it is widely anticipated that the President intends to nominate Dr. Ashton Carter to be the next Secretary of Defense, perhaps as early as tomorrow. And I welcome that nomination. Should Dr. Carter take over the helm at the Defense Department, it would coincide with an ominous development on a national security issue that he and I have dealt with together in the past. And that issue is the growing danger that Iran will soon be able to develop nuclear weapons and the inability of prolonged negotiations with Iran to prevent them from doing so. In 2008, Ash Carter and I participated in co-authoring a report by the Bipartisan Policy Center entitled Meeting the Challenge: U.S. Policy Toward Iranian Nuclear Development. In that report, we acknowledged that Iran's nuclear program would pose, and I quote, the most significant strategic threat to the United States during the next administration. That group, which was co-chaired by former Senator Chuck Robb and myself, and included many with long and well-respected credentials on foreign policy matters. That report emphasized also what was at stake in our engaging in this issue. What was at stake? What would the consequences be if Iran was allowed to achieve nuclear weapons capability? And I want to quote from what we said and concluded. A nuclear-ready or nuclear-armed Islamic Republic ruled by the clerical regime could threaten the Persian Gulf region and its vast energy resources, spark nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East, inject additional volatility into global energy markets, embolden extremists in the region, and destabilize states such as Saudi Arabia and others in the region, provide nuclear technology to other radical regimes and terrorists, and seek to make good on its threats to eradicate Israel. That is why this threat has been labeled by most in the intelligence community, if not all, as the most significant long-term threat to the United States. And this was written in 2008. Now, 6 years later, into this current administration, we can see the truth of those judgments. Unfortunately, what we have also seen is that this administration has not dealt effectively with this growing threat. In our Bipartisan Policy Center report, Ash Carter and I called for direct negotiations with Iran, but on the condition that these negotiations were backed by strong economic sanctions and the threat of military force as a last resort if all other efforts failed to achieve the stated goal of preventing Iran from attaining the capability of producing nuclear weapons. We did not come to this conclusion easily. We debated it for weeks and months. We debated each phase of the potential negotiation with Iran through diplomacy, through the imposition of sanctions, through the potential threat of military force, and to ultimately the need to use military force if we could not achieve the desired objective. We obviously made that a last resort if all other efforts had failed. And this, as I said, was written in 2008. Most relevant at this moment was our insistence, and I quote from the report here again, any U.S.-Iranian talks will not be open-ended, but will be limited to a predetermined time period so that Tehran does not try to run out the clock. This was our deepest concern, that failure to move forward in terms of an ever-ratcheting and tightening regime of diplomacy, sanctions, and threat of force, if it did not achieve that goal, and it hasn't to this date. But the concern here is that Iran would run out the clock. In the meantime, continue to spin the centrifuges and add to those methods which were producing the ability for them to obtain nuclear weapon capability. Now, more than 6 years later, after prolonged negotiations and yet another extension of talks without achieving the stated goal of ending the regime's quest, it is time to reassess where we currently stand. President Obama is not only ignoring the clear and present danger by Iranian ambitions, he is abetting those ambitions by surrendering key positions first and then pursuing negotiations that confirm our weakness. For 8 years, U.S. policy, backed by 6 United Nations Security Council resolutions, insisted that Iran abandon its program to enrich uranium because of the mortal danger it would arm itself with nuclear weapons. That policy was discarded virtually at the start of the negotiations with Iran, these recent negotiations, well, a year and a half or so ago. Indeed, that was discarded even before the negotiations began. And although the subjects of uranium enrichment, weapons programs, inspection regimes, nuclear power are highly complex and the discussions have been lengthy, they all lead now to a very simple question. Indeed, the one question at the core of the issue from the beginning is, how much ability will Iran have to enrich uranium, and how many centrifuges will it be permitted to operate in reaching their goal? When the UN Security Council passed its first resolution demanding that Iran cease enriching uranium, Iran then had 800 centrifuges doing that illegal work. Today, after 2 years of direct negotiations on this specific issue, Iran has 19,000 centrifuges. Let me repeat that. After 2 years of direct negotiations, Iran has moved from 800 centrifuges to 19,000. Any negotiated agreement that gives Iran the ability to retain so much uranium capability is completely unacceptable, and the Senate should prevent such failure from being ratified or otherwise accepted by this Congress. When it comes to negotiation strategy, we should learn from past failures. This is not the first time we've been through something like this. An instructional example comes from our experience with North Korea. When I first served in the United States Senate, we were dealing with this very subject. Starting with the so-called agreed framework in 1994, we tried to resolve the North Korea nuclear problem by cycles of negotiations salted with incentives. Does that sound familiar? Cycles of negotiations salted with incentives. We have, at various times, relieved international economic sanctions pressure in return for promises of improved behavior from the North Koreans. As we pursued inconsistent and diffident strategies, the North Koreans responded with bouts of hostility, cynical manipulation, and threats. They have repeatedly tested missiles with nuclear capability, revealed a vast new uranium enrichment facility previously undetected by the International Atomic Energy Association and our own services, tested nuclear weapons, intimidated and threatened their neighbors, and continued to build their nuclear weapons arsenal. I distinctly remember being on this floor, questioning our ability to verify that the Koreans would live up to what they promised to do, and that is not develop nuclear weapon capability. Oh, we have this all wired in. We have their promise. We have provided aid to them in the aid, nature of food and the nature of a number of financial incentives, and we have the verification procedures in place. We know that none of that worked. We know that we were rope-a-doped by the North Koreans just as we're being rope-a-doped by the Iranians. And so we have a precedent here on which we ought to be basing our decisions in terms of how we go forward. Doing what we're doing is not the way to defuse a critical threat to our national security. This is a view, by the way, that Ash Carter has expressed emphatically, and one of the major reasons why I so strongly will urge for his confirmation to be Secretary of Defense. To the contrary, Secretary Kerry, who energetically leads the current negotiation strategy with Iran, should surely have learned from the fallacies of the North Korea agreed framework example, which was that strategy's predecessor. When Senator Kerry and I were both in the Senate, he strongly supported the North Korea strategy and was harshly critical of the Bush administration for not doing the same. In March 2001, then Senator Kerry said, and I quote, "The Clinton administration left a framework on the table which could, if pursued aggressively by the Bush administration, go a long way toward reducing the threat posed by North Korean missiles and missile exports." 2 days ago, he said, Secretary of State Colin Powell stated that the Bush administration would pick up where the Clinton administration left off. Secretary Kerry went on to say, yesterday, President Bush told President Kim that the administration would not resume missile talks with North Korea anytime soon. I believe this is a serious mistake in judgment by the President, then Senator Kerry said. Now, after the clear and massive failure of negotiations with North Korea, Secretary Kerry is pursuing a Groundhog Day strategy for dealing with Iran. We now know for certain that North Korea was simply using negotiations to lead us down that garden path to cynical noncompliance. So why do Secretary Kerry and President Obama continue to believe blindly in hopeful talks rather than hard-edged compulsion? This unguided blindness leads us to a second problem. The administration has ignored not only the United Nations Security Council, but the U.S. Congress as well. The administration has been clear about its intention to circumvent congressional scrutiny and agreement of any deal because of widespread bipartisan opposition. And I believe that is a serious mistake. Any settlement of issues regarding Iran's nuclear program is of paramount importance to the security of the American people and the security and stability of the world. Any proposed agreement requires thorough review and deliberation by this Congress. An agreement on an issue of such vast significance requires a bipartisan, bicameral consensus and mutual support and agreement by both the executive and legislative branches of government. Anything less than that should not be acceptable. This is the most significant national security issue of our age, and it is being mishandled, apparently to secure a legacy for the administration. Thus, it is all the more important to assert a vigorous congressional role before we are burdened with a bad agreement that does little to prevent a nuclear Iran. These negotiations with Iran began by yielding on the central issue. They now continue while ignoring the proper essential role of Congress, and it appears that they are aimed at achieving a legacy for the Obama administration rather than enhancing national security. Most serious and dangerous of all is the strategic vacuum in which these Iran negotiations are taking place. Their failure will force us to face that void. And when we do, we must then return to the world that existed before these misguided negotiations began. We will have to renew and reinforce our efforts to impose crippling sanctions on Iran. We will have to redouble our efforts to bring our allies and friends along with us, preventing the carefully constructed international sanctions regimes from slipping. And now we must find ways to limit the damage being done by an irresponsible Russia, already signing deals with Iran worth billions of dollars. Unfortunately, and most challenging of all, we must find a way to make the threat of using military force as a last resort credible. That won't be easy. Our nation is militarily, politically, economically, and emotionally exhausted by wars, and now we have been forced to embark on yet another. Americans are justifiably repulsed by and fixated on the more immediate chaos of televised beheadings. A more abstract future threat of a nuclear Iran is beyond the horizon of most Americans. But the Ayatollahs are counting on that, and it is one of the many ways the conflicts in Iraq and Syria are connected to our Iranian dilemma. Coping with all of that at once is what leadership is all about. 4 American presidents, including our current president, have declared that a nuclear weapons-capable Iran is unacceptable. I'd like to repeat that. 4 American presidents, including this current president, have declared that a nuclear-capable Iran is unacceptable. To give meaning to that repeated commitment, to do whatever is necessary to prevent Iran from gaining that dangerous capability, is the most urgent matter facing the United States and international security. A robust uranium enrichment industry in Iran means a capability to produce nuclear weapons within an unacceptably brief amount of time. The consequences of a nuclear weapons-capable Iran are not tolerable, not acceptable, and must motivate the most powerful and effective efforts possible to prevent it from happening. That is our challenge. That is the role of the United States Senate. So we must insist on playing a significant role in the examination of whatever is being done and whatever might be put before us, and insist that it will be put before us so that we can examine it carefully and not repeat the mistakes of the past as we have with the North Koreans. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of quorum.